Let me tell you, folks, our kids are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with some terrible issues called PT, post-traumatic syndrome disorder. And it is real. Probably has been real for every single war. We have with us today a man who works with those people and has some advice.
It's time for the Newsmaker Show on News Talk AM 1480 WLEA. Here's Kevin Doran.
St. Louis, Dr. Stephen HAYMON. Doctor, I don't know, are you a psychologist or a psychiatrist?
Psychologist.
Okay. And you are an African-American?
African-American.
All right, let me tell you an interesting story that my kids want me to record. When I was 18 years old, in the 50s, when segregation was the law in the South, I took a job in Mississippi as a disc jockey, right? And I took a train to Chicago, and Chicago went down to St. Louis, and St. Louis on to Mississippi. Now, remember, I'd never run across this. I didn't even know what segregation was. But I remember the train stopped in St. Louis, Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio, and all of the Negroes, as they were then called, had to go back into the last coaches. And almost every one of those guys had white shirts. I don't know why. And then they would open the windows, and all you could see is the white shirts sticking out the windows. That was my first taste of segregation, and it happened in St. Louis. Now, I know that's ancient history, but isn't it wonderful how much progress has been made in, what, we're now 60, 70 years?
Kevin, you didn't hear. I said 62 years. So I remember segregation, particularly in St. Louis. I would go down to what they call the 5 and 10 cent store, and I could order stuff, but I couldn't eat at the counter. My father took us down to Pine Bluff, Arkansas. This was the early 50s, and he was going, probably mid-50s. He was going to fill up his tank, and when he did so, I saw a water fountain. There was one that said color, and there was one that said white. And so the one that was colored was dirty. I remember this graphically. And the one that was, I said white, it was clean. So I went towards, as a little kid, I was young, I went to the one that was clean. And my father screamed, ran over to me and grabbed me and put me in the car. And this actually happened. And the guy, the owner of the station, looked at my father, and he charged, although I didn't get any water, he charged my father for water. And it wasn't the water. He was just charging him because in his mind, he thought I should have known better rather than go to the wrong water fountain. And I remember my mother and father talking about that. And I didn't understand, because I didn't understand segregation at that. I couldn't have been any more than 7 or 8 years old. So I didn't understand what segregation was, but I knew that the fountain that said color was dirty. But anyway, that's not here to there. But yeah, things have changed. However, I had this conversation with another radio announcer, and I said, no matter where I am now, being where I am, I will never forget that I am an African-American male.
No. There's certain things that happen to you, and that's what we're talking about today, post-traumatic syndrome. I never served in the military, and therefore never in a combat zone. I've seen a few things I wish I hadn't seen over the years, but I've talked to enough young fellows coming back from Vietnam, mostly from Iraq and Afghanistan, where they've had to serve long, long times, much longer than the guys in World War II, as a matter of fact. And they just see certain things they're not supposed to, that no human being should have to see or take part in. I want you to talk about that with me.
Thank you for the entree, Kevin, because that's something I believe that I can address probably not in depth as I would like to. However, I was one of those guys that got drafted in the 60s into the Vietnam War. I came back, went to school, and started working for the Veterans Administration, the hospital, VA hospital, in the chemical dependency. They didn't call it chemical dependency at that particular time. And we had so many of our soldiers coming back with the addiction to opiates. So, and I know you remember what happened over in the Vietnam War because it was a very unpopular war. However, the people that are coming back with these addictions, because they were using the opiates, the alcohol, but particularly the opiates, whether it was heroin, whether it was marijuana, whatever it was, to cope with what was going on. Because it was a very frightening situation. There was a lot of uncertainty there. Obviously, you didn't know who to trust and who not to trust. A lot of killing, a lot of destroying. And that's not how we typically orientate our children. We want them to be considerate. We want them to share. We want our children to not work ill towards anyone. But you go into a war zone, and it's completely opposite than that. So we were using distractions to anesthetize themselves to deal with the issues that were in the Vietnam War, and here we were addressing them. At least we were addressing the opiate addiction with methadone, which is another opiate, another derivative of opiates. And at that particular time, there was no such title as post-traumatic stress as it related to people going into the wars and fighting. In retrospect, because since I've done this for 40 years, Kevin, I realize, and since I do a lot of traveling to the military bases, particularly with Afghanistan and Iraq veterans, I see what post-traumatic stress is. I recognize that was exactly what was going on, but we were treating a symptom rather than the cause for what the people were doing. So when people are in war zones, there's a possibility that they can see someone that they love or someone that they work with die. They can see people get mutilated. They can see explosions. They can destroy the individual's enemies' homes and children, and it's pretty traumatic to experience that. So even if you don't get shot, even if you don't lose a limb or something like that, just watching the destruction has a profound effect on your mind and your emotions. And so when people are over there and they're using different skills to cope with what they're doing, because remember, that's not their training. And when they come back and they have to acclimate to what's going on here in the States, in their hometown, in their home environment, it requires a big transition. And let me tell you, whether or not people get diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or not, the trauma of being there is going to affect people. Now, some affects more than others. However, when you have to assimilate or acclimate back into the home environment, it's going to take its toll, not just on you, but your wife and your children.
I'm talking with Dr. Stephen HAYMON. He is a psychologist in St. Louis. Apparently you do work for the government, too. Is that right, Doctor?
I do work for the, well, let me back up. I'm one of the providers for the military, so I'm a TRICARE provider. But I also travel throughout the country because I am a vet myself to different military bases to make myself available. I work with the chaplains. I work with the personnel that have been chosen to work with post-traumatic stress veterans and things. So currently I get to experience what the soldiers are dealing with as they come back from the war zone.
How about you when you were in Vietnam? Did you have similar experiences?
Well, unfortunately or fortunately, I didn't go to Vietnam.
Thank God. Thank God, yes.
But I was a chaplain's assistant, which is ironic because the work I do now is spiritual, and I wasn't spiritual at that particular time. So I was I was getting people prepared to go over to the war, or they were coming back, and so I was servicing those people then.
Those of us who were old enough to remember the end of World War II or the 50s, and a lot of guys came back from Europe and the South Pacific alcoholic. Now, they didn't have access to marijuana and all the things that the Chinese communists kindly provided to our guys in Vietnam. They made sure our kids got those things. But there's certain things young people or anyone you're not supposed to see. And it's hard to live with. Now, when we take a little break, we're going to get back here with Dr. HAYMON. I'm going to ask him about some of the examples that he's run across. Obviously, we won't use names or locations, but stay tuned. I'm talking with Dr. Stephen HAYMON. He's a psychologist in St. Louis. He works with vets with post-traumatic syndrome. I'm saying young men, young women now too, of course. Now, just two things I want to accomplish in this second half and last half of the show, Doctor. First, give us a couple of examples, and then the final thing I want to do is to talk to people, have you talk to people who have folks coming back home and what they should look for, what they should do. And I don't mean just family. These can be coworkers, friends, you name it. All right, go ahead. What are some of the things you've had to treat?
Okay. First and foremost, because you and I have spoken about this in the first half of this interview, abuse of substances, whether it's alcohol or drugs, whether it's sex, pornography, or gambling, because what happens is you have to anesthetize or mitigate what it is that you've experienced mentally and emotionally. And a lot of times, particularly the families that come into the office, their wives are bringing in the husband or vice versa, and they're coming in with an identified problem such as the substances. But remember, people don't like feeling what they're feeling. They're having these nightmares. They're having cold sweats. They're paranoid. They're isolating from people. They tend to be insensitive to the needs of other people. There's disassociative hallucinations. There's a foreboding future. There are also things like a combative attitude, because that's what it takes to survive. I think I said insensitivity, waking up in cold sweats, daydreaming, staring off, angry, intense rage about insignificant things, and even paranoia as it relates to what that person thinks other people are doing. So when people are coming in here, all those things may exist, but because no one wants to seem weak from being over there, no one will identify themselves as experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. What they'll say is, okay, well, I have a drinking problem, so I'll go in here with you. But once the person or the family gets in here, then you can see some of the things I just mentioned, some of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Now, the big issue here is the same survival or coping skills you need in war are not the same ones you need to assimilate back in the family. So that dissonance is what causes the family to come in to see a drug clinicians like myself. And it's very much evident. But it is important that if people are stirring or people have behavior or they're drinking or drugging or doing things that are not common before they went to the war and they start doing these things, those are telltale signs that say, well, wait a minute, let me look at this a little further, and perhaps we need to be supportive and advocate. Maybe we need to talk to a professional about this.
Doctor, why is it, maybe this is not possible to answer, some guys go through a terrible event, and it doesn't ever seem to bother them. Other guys go through the same or similar event, and they're troubled the rest of their life, and they may self-medicate with booze or drugs. But nevertheless, why is it that one person might suffer and the other one not seem to suffer?
Kevin, let me try to answer that question like this. People who are sociopaths or narcissistic, they can be in a terrible, pernicious environment like that, and it doesn't affect them. And a sociopath person is a person that does not operate from a conscious, so they can kill and they can destroy, or they can see people getting killed or getting mutilated or something along those lines there. And it just doesn't affect them because the conscious is not there. A narcissistic person does not have the ability to see someone else's perspective. They're very goal-orientated as to what's important to them. And so they tend to do well in combat zones, so they get promoted and they're put in charge of things. And so but they went into the service that way, they went into the war zone that way, and they come out being the same things that they were. So people said they were not affected. Well, yeah, when you see something that does, but not to the same degree that a person is not like that. So the construct of the person, the way the person was reared, the orientation of the person will play a major role in how a person, will react to a war situation as pernicious as seeing someone getting destroyed or mutilated or something like that. So it really has to do with the coping skills, developmental skills, just surviving in general, the temperament, the mindset, how the person, again, is constructed as to how the counter effect that the war is going to have on the individuals. And someone asked me the other day, is it more prevalent for men than it is for women? Well, trauma is trauma. If a man gets raped, it's traumatizing. If a woman gets raped, it's traumatizing. However, a woman tends to ventilate more so or more often, and since she's a social entity, she tends to connect to other people. Men tend to ingest.
Hold it in, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so they operate, and when we finally find out that this person, in a lot of cases, when we finally find out that this person is experiencing post-traumatic stress, then they have shot up the office, or they kill their family and then kill themselves, or they'll do something else that is apparent that there was trauma in that person's life. Then we say, oh, okay, but before that, none of us want to believe that sending our boys over into war is having an effect not just on them, but their families also.
Okay, we're all supposed to be Duke Waynes, but Duke never really served. He might have... I have friends of mine who do a lot of Civil War reenactment, and that's fine. But I say, if those guys really went through a battle, and it wasn't pretend, they might have a totally different attitude toward this reenactment. Now, we're getting down to the last couple minutes. Dr. Stephen HAYMON, who is an expert on this issue. You mentioned earlier, casually, that you weren't a very spiritual guy when you were in Vietnam, and apparently that's changed, or you wouldn't have said I wasn't then. Right. Is there a spiritual, as in God? I'll use that almost forbidden word. Is there a spiritual dimension, religion, God, that these young people or these people need to pursue in order to overcome this or live with it better? Huh?
Let me put it this way. First of all, religion and spiritual are two different things. Religion, we tend to follow a group of people with a group of norms. We have certain things that we do and we don't do, and so we attach to that. Spirituality, a oneness relationship with God, understanding that God governs our lives, and so He can mitigate whatever is going on because we know He's the one in control. That's something I had to learn, because although I grew up in church, I was religious. My parents were, I call it Pharisaic in that there were a lot of things that we did and did not do, so that didn't make me spiritual. And I knew of God through my mother and father and my perhaps the preacher when I was young, but I didn't know Him for myself. God will mitigate things because there's a scripture It's called Philippians 4:4. It says, "Be anxious for nothing, but let your requests be known in prayer and supplication, and the peace of God that surpasses all understanding," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when that becomes who we are, no matter what the circumstances are, Kevin, it tends to help calm us no matter what's going on. So people who experience post-traumatic stress, there are some methodical or some logistical things that need to occur. However, the encompassing of everything you do will be a oneness relationship with God. And again, that's different than religion. And even as I practice in my office or I'm on the military base, I advocate an awareness of God from my perspective. And I'm able to do that and to help people to understand there is that difference, because we all need to believe in something greater than ourselves.
Doctor, our time is up. I'd like you to stay on the line a moment, if you would. Dr. Stephen HAYMON, our guest today, psychologist, St. Louis, works with vets suffering from post-traumatic syndrome. And I've heard this from many people. I read it in the first time I think I read it was All's Quiet on the Western Front. One of the German soldiers says, "Next time we have war, let's send our leaders in." Well, first, and see if they really like it. If not, why then nuts to it. Okay, the only trouble is most of our leaders are narcissistic. A guy like Clinton or Obama, both of whom apparently are narcissistic, and who knows how many other presidents were. Maybe they could have done all that and not have been affected. Well, I don't think so, but we'll see. That's it for now. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for more news and information here on AM 1480 WLEA.